Pragmatism by William James. You see how naturally one comes to the humanistic principle. You can't weed out the human contribution. Our nouns and adjectives are all humanized heirlooms, and in the theories we build them into, the inner order and arrangement is wholly dictated by human considerations, intellectual consistency being one of them. Mathematics and logic themselves are fermenting with human rearrangements. Physics, astronomy, and biology follow massive cues of preference. We plunge forward into the field of fresh experience with the beliefs our ancestors and we have made already. These determined what we notice determines what we do again determines what we experience. So from one thing to another, although the stubborn fact remains that there is a sensible flux, what is true of it seems from first to last to be largely a matter of our own creation. We build the flux out inevitably. The great question is, does it, with our additions, rise or fall in value? Are the additions worthy or unworthy? Suppose a universe composed of 7 stars and nothing else but 3 human witnesses and their critic. One witness names the stars Great Bear. One calls them Charles Wayne. One calls them the Dipper. Which human addition has made the best universe of the given stellar material? If Fredrik Myers were the critic, he would have no hesitation in turning down the American witness. Lotze has in several places made a deep suggestion. We naively assume, he says, a relation between reality and our minds which may be just the opposite of the true one. Reality, we naturally think, stands ready-made and complete, and our intellects supervene with the one simple duty of describing it as it is already. But may not our descriptions, Lotze asks, be themselves important additions to reality? And may not previous reality itself be there, far less for the purpose of reappearing unaltered in our knowledge than for the very purpose of stimulating our minds to such additions as shall enhance the universe's total value? Die Erhöhung des vorgefundenen Designs is a phrase used by Professor Eucken somewhere, which reminds one of this suggestion by the great Lotze. It is identically our pragmatistic conception. In our cognitive as well as in our active life we are creative. We add both to the subject and to the predicate part of reality. The world stands really malleable, waiting to receive its final touches at our hands. Like the kingdom of heaven, it suffers human violence willingly. Man engenders truths upon it. No one can deny that such a role would add both to our dignity and to our responsibility as thinkers. To some of us it proves a most inspiring notion. Signer Papini, the leader of Italian pragmatism, grows fairly dithyrambic over the view that it opens, of man's divinely creative functions. The import of the difference between pragmatism and rationalism is now in sight throughout its whole extent. The essential contrast is that for rationalism reality is ready-made and complete from all eternity, while for pragmatism it is still in the making, and awaits part of its complexion from the future. On the one side, the universe is absolutely secure, on the other, it is still pursuing its adventures. We have got into rather deep water with this humanistic view, and it is no wonder that misunderstanding gathers round it. It is accused of being a doctrine of caprice. Mr. Bradley, for example, says that a humanist, if he understood his own doctrine, would have to hold any end, however perverted, to be rational if I insist on it personally, and any idea, however mad, to be the truth, if only someone is resolved that he will have it so. The humanist view of reality as something resisting yet malleable, which controls our thinking as an energy that must be taken account of incessantly, though not necessarily merely copied, is evidently a difficult one to introduce to novices. The situation reminds me of one that I have personally gone through. I once wrote an essay on our right to believe, which I unluckily called The Will to Believe. All the critics, neglecting the essay, pounced upon the title. Psychologically it was impossible, morally it was iniquitous. The will to deceive, the will to make believe, were wittily proposed as substitutes for it. The alternative between pragmatism and rationalism in the shape in which we now have it before us is no longer a question in the theory of knowledge. It concerns the structure of the universe itself. On the pragmatist side, we have only one edition of the universe, unfinished, growing in all sorts of places, especially in the places where thinking beings are at work. On the rationalist side we have a universe in many editions, one real one, the infinite folio or edition deluxe, eternally complete, and then the various finite editions, full of false readings, distorted and mutilated each in its own way. So the rival metaphysical hypotheses of pluralism and monism here come back upon us. I will develop their differences during the remainder of our hour. And first let me say that it is impossible not to see a temperamental difference at work in the choice of sides. The rationalist mind, radically taken, is of a doctrinaire and authoritative complexion. The phrase "must be" is ever on its lips. The belly band of its universe must be tight. A radical pragmatist, on the other hand, is a happy-go-lucky anarchistic sort of creature. If he had to live in a tub like Diogenes, he wouldn't mind at all if the hoops were loose and the staves let in the sun. Now, the idea of this loose universe affects your typical rationalists in much the same way as freedom of the press might affect a veteran official in the Russian Bureau of Censorship, or as simplified spelling might affect an elderly schoolmistress. It affects him as the swarm of Protestant sects affects a papist onlooker. It appears as the backboneless and devoid of principle as opportunism in politics appears to an old-fashioned French legitimist, or to a fanatical believer in the divine right of the people. For pluralistic pragmatism, truth grows up inside of all the finite experiences. They lean on each other, but the whole of them, if such a whole there be, leans on nothing. All homes are in finite experience. Finite experience as such is homeless. Nothing outside of the flux secures the issue of it. It can hope salvation only from its own intrinsic promises and potencies. To rationalists this describes a tramp and vagrant world, adrift in space, with neither elephant nor tortoise to plant the sole of its foot upon. It is a set of stars hurled into heaven without even a center of gravity to pull against. In other spheres of life it is true that we have got used to living in a state of relative insecurity. The authority of the state and that of an absolute moral law have resolved themselves into expediencies, and Holy Church has resolved itself into meeting houses. Not so as yet within the philosophic classrooms. A universe, with such as us, contributing to create its truth, a world delivered to our opportunisms and our private judgments. Home rule for Ireland would be a millennium in comparison. We're no more fit for such a part than the Filipinos are fit for self-government. Such a world would not be respectable philosophically. It is a trunk without a tag, a dog without a collar, in the eyes of most professors of philosophy. What then would tighten this loose universe according to the professors? Something to support the finite many, to tie it to unify and anchor it, something unexposed to accident, something eternal and unalterable. The mutable in experience must be founded on immutability. Behind our de facto world, our world in act, there must be a de jure duplicate, fixed and previous, with all that can happen here already there in posse, every drop of blood, every smallest item, appointed and provided, stamped and branded, without chance of variation. The negatives that haunt our ideals here below must be themselves negated in the absolutely real. This alone makes the universe solid. This is the resting deep. We live upon the stormy surface, but with this our anchor holds, for it grapples rocky bottom. This is Wordsworth's central place subsisting at the heart of endless agitation. This is Vivekananda's mystical one of which I read to you. This is reality with the big R, reality that makes the timeless claim, reality to which defeat can't happen. This is what the men of principles, and in general all the men whom I called tender-minded in my first lecture, think themselves obliged to postulate. And this, exactly this, is what the tough-minded of that lecture find themselves moved to call a piece of perverse abstraction worship. The tough-minded are the men whose alpha and omega are facts. Behind the bare phenomenal facts, as my tough-minded old friend Chauncey Wright, the great Harvard empiricist of my youth, used to say, there is nothing. When a rationalist insists that behind the fact there is the ground of the facts, the possibility of the facts, the tougher empiricists accuse him of taking the mere name and nature of a fact and clapping it behind the fact as a duplicate entity to make it possible. That such sham grounds are often invoked is notorious. At a surgical operation I heard a bystander ask a doctor why the patient breathed so deeply. Because ether is a respiratory stimulant, the doctor answered. Ah, said the questioner, as if relieved by the explanation. But this is like saying that cyanide of potassium kills because it is a poison, or that it is so cold tonight because it is winter, or that we have 5 fingers because we are pentadactyls. These are but names for the facts, taken from the facts and then treated as previous and explanatory. The tender-minded notion of an absolute reality is, according to the radically tough-minded, framed on just this pattern. It is but our summarizing name for the whole spread out and strung along mass of phenomena, treated as if it were a different entity, both one and previous. You see how differently people take things. The world we live in exists diffused and distributed in the form of an indefinitely numerous lots of eaches, coherent in all sorts of ways and degrees, and the tough-minded are perfectly willing to keep them at that valuation. They can stand that kind of world, their temper being well adapted to its insecurity. Not so the tender-minded party. They must back the world we find ourselves born into, by another and a better world, in which the eaches form and the all a one that logically presupposes, co-implicates and secures each without exception. Must we as pragmatists be radically tough-minded, or can we treat the absolute edition of the world as a legitimate hypothesis? It is certainly legitimate, for it is thinkable, whether we take it in its abstract or in its concrete shape. By taking it abstractly, I mean placing it behind our finite life as we place the word winter behind tonight's cold weather. Winter is only the name for a certain number of days, which we find generally characterized by cold weather, but it guarantees nothing in that line, for our thermometer tomorrow may soar into the 70s. Nevertheless, the word is a useful one to plunge forward with into the stream of our experience. It cuts off certain probabilities and sets up others. You can put away your straw hats, you can unpack your architects. It is a summary of things to look for. It names a part of nature's habits and gets you ready for their continuation. It is a definite instrument, abstracted from experience, a conceptual reality that you must take account of, and which reflects you totally back into sensible realities. The pragmatist is the last person to deny the reality of such abstractions. They are so much past experience funded. But taking the absolute edition of the world concretely means a different hypothesis. Rationalists take it concretely and oppose it to the world's finite editions. They give it a particular nature. It is perfect, finished. Everything known there is known along with everything else. Here, where ignorance reigns, far otherwise. If there is want there, there also is the satisfaction provided. Here all is process, the world is timeless. Possibilities obtain in our world, in the absolute world, where all that is not is from eternity impossible, and all that is necessary. The category of possibility has no application. In this world crimes and horrors are regrettable. In that totalized world regret obtains not, for the existence of ill in the temporal order is the very condition of the perfection of the eternal order. Once more, either hypothesis is legitimate in pragmatist eyes, for either has its uses. Abstractly, or taking like the word winter as a memorandum of past experience that orients us towards the future, the notion of the absolute world is indispensable. Concretely taken, it is also indispensable, at least to certain minds, for it determines them religiously, being often a thing to change their lives by, and by changing their lives, to change whatever in the outer order depends on them. We cannot therefore methodically join the tough minds in the rejections of the whole notion of a world beyond our finite experience. One misunderstanding of pragmatism is to identify it with positivistic tough-mindedness, to suppose that it scorns every rationalistic notion as so much jabber and gesticulation, that it loves intellectual anarchy as such, and prefers a sort of wolf world absolutely unpenned and wild and without a master or a collar to any philosophic classroom product whatsoever. I have said so much in these lectures against the over-tender forms of rationalism that I am prepared for some misunderstanding here, but I confess that the amount of it that I have found in this very audience surprises me, for I have simultaneously defended rationalistic hypotheses so far as these redirect you fruitfully into experience. For instance, I received this morning this question on a postcard. Is a pragmatist necessarily a complete materialist and agnostic? One of my oldest friends, who ought to know me better, writes me a letter that accuses the pragmatism I am recommending of shutting out all wider metaphysical views and condemning us to the most terre-à-terre naturalism. Let me read you some extracts from it. It seems to me, my friend writes, that the pragmatic objection to pragmatism lies in the fact that it might accentuate the narrowness of narrow minds. Your call to the rejection of the namby-pamby and the wishy-washy is of course inspiring. But although it is salutary and stimulating to be told that one should be responsible for the immediate issues and bearings of his words and thoughts, I decline to be deprived of the pleasure and profit of dwelling also on remoter bearings and issues, and it is the tendency of pragmatism to refuse this privilege. In short, it seems to me that the limitations, or rather the dangers, of the pragmatic tendency are analogous to those which beset the unwary followers of the natural sciences. Chemistry and physics are eminently pragmatic, and many of their devotees, smugly content with the data that their weights and measures furnish, feel an infinite pity and disdain for all students of philosophy and metaphysics whomsoever. And of course everything can be expressed, after a fashion, and theoretically, in terms of chemistry and physics, that is, everything except the vital principle of the whole, and that, they say, there is no pragmatic use in trying to express. It has no bearings for them. I for my part refuse to be persuaded that we cannot look beyond the obvious pluralism of the naturalist and the pragmatist to a logical unity in which they take no interest. How is such a conception of the pragmatism I am advocating possible, after my first and second lectures? I have all along been offering it expressly as a mediator between tough-mindedness and tender-mindedness. If the notion of a world ante rem, whether taken abstractly like the word winter, or concretely as the hypothesis of an absolute, can be shown to have any consequences whatever for our life, it has a meaning. If the meaning works, it will have some truth that ought to be held to through all possible reformulations for pragmatism. The absolutistic hypothesis, that perfection is eternal, aboriginal, and most real, has a perfectly definite meaning, and it works religiously. To examine how will be the subject of my next and final lecture. End of lecture 7.